I guess I've learned not to follow Slav Petrov at conferences. So when the organizers invited me, I thought, well, the main goal of their main goal must have been to let's see, how do I click to my slides? Oh, I see, I'm doing it. Okay. I'm already evidencing the statement I'm going to make, but the main goal was to raise the mean age of this group to about 26. So I thought I can do that just being myself. And then I looked at the other speakers and the topics, and I thought, I wonder if I have anything actually that's interesting to this community. And I thought, well, okay, I'll try. So that's the goal anyway, is to race through a couple of very different projects that count as related to data science for me, and hope maybe that they trigger some thoughts for you. And the two projects, the first I'm going to talk about, joint with Alix Roule, Jean-Philippe Cointet, and myself, is on political thought in the United States. And the second project is on the autism epidemic. And actually, they have absolutely nothing in common, except that you might say they're both about substantively important things, that is, things that people care about. And they also have the unfortunate fact that I'm involved in both of them. So that's the linkage that I'm going to try to connect. So let me start then with this first project, the goal of which is to try to understand if we can identify the morphology and the content of what might be distinctly modern political thought in the United States, and somehow distinguish that morphology and content from what might have been a traditional political discourse that preceded it. And so by morphology, let me say, and by way of analogy, that if I were to say to you, once upon a time, a young girl set out to make her fortune and blah, 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 you'd immediately recognize that the story, starting once upon a time, was a fairy tale, which is a specific kind of genre whose morphology, and we know this from the work of Vladimir Propp, is characterized by 29 operators that are largely sequential, and they operate on objects. The objects in fairy tales might be ghosts or witches or ogres or frogs and so on. But whatever the things that are operated on are largely transposable. So it doesn't matter for our understanding that it's a fairy tale when we hear once upon a time a small girl set out to make her fortune. It doesn't exactly matter if it's a witch or a frog that the child encounters and overcomes as the story unfolds. We recognize that as a fairy tale. And it's in that sense that I want to identify a morphology or a structure for modern political thought. And also, in addition, I do want to try to get some purchase on content. That is, I want to know what it is also that political discourse is about practically. So that's the goal, is to identify morphology and content. And to do that, to do something like that for using text analysis anyway, that has an implication for the kinds of data structures that we have to use. And the implication might be the following, which is, first, the data structures have to span the history of the United States. That is, over 200 years. And the provenance of those data structures has to be the same over those 200 years. Otherwise, if we have multiple different kinds of provenance, then we can't actually figure out where the change is coming from. And thirdly, if we're interested in something important like political structure, then the data structures that we use have to arise from a substantively important context or institution. So it may be that a lot of different kinds of data structures satisfy those three requirements. They're not actually trivial, but the data structure that I'll use for now is the annual State of the Union, which is an address that's given by presidents every year, actually is given every year but once, and which shape and are shaped by public opinion, and which drive and are driven by the political issues and framings of their time. So the first thing that one encounters when when one works with text that's not kind of like the last 2 weeks of Twitter, but text that spans a long period of time, the first thing one encounters is the obvious fact that the meaning of a word is completely conditional on its position in a network of words to which it's tied. That is, word meaning's not fixed, but arises from the population of words that it's linked to. And in this slide, I'm going to show you what happens when you just look at the word constitution. And it seems like it's unlikely you can actually see what's there, so I'll assert that at different moments in time over the State of the Union address, the word constitution is embedded in completely different networks of words. At one moment it refers to the law, at another moment it refers to people, and so on. And so because words change their meaning over time and their meaning is conditioned by their position in a network of other words, the usual strategies of defining words, which work perfectly for temporally bounded short texts, but the usual strategy for defining words on the basis of dictionaries that have only a modern or completely ahistorical standpoint, or actually on the basis of some kind of assignment probabilistically to topics, as in topic modelings, won't be successful. And that instead we have to think of a way to capture directly the network underpinnings of meaning, which is what we're doing here. So that's the kind of key conceptual move. And then just to recap, the data structure, our State of the Union speeches, the goal is to understand morphology and to try to figure out if we can learn something about context. So the first thing one can say about the State of the Union speeches is that they're a continuous form. So this is just a simple bag of words approach. And you can see in this graph moving from year to year that the variation in the words that are used in the State of the Union address are completely minimal. And yet, from the darkness and the lightness of the graph, you can also identify clear periods, the first partition of which that separates kind of modern and traditional discourse is 1917, which isn't to say that the 1917 address has actually anything unusual in it at all. It doesn't. It's to say that after 1917, in the speeches of 1918, 1929, 1945, 1978, and so on, we can see, standing in 2015, that those speeches come to be more similar to the one in 1917. That is, the future of the text that we're analyzing is what activates the text in 1917 as distinctly on the spline between modernity and tradition. So weirdly, those speeches are continuous whether or not presidents or parties change. Actually, you might have known that already. Like, it doesn't matter if there's a Republican and then a Democrat, and year to year has absolutely no effect on the kind of bag of words approach. Okay, so now you know that. What does the structure look like statically? So what can we generate a semantic mapping of all the speeches in order to directly, that is, visually investigate the inner structure of each cluster of terms as well as their relationship to each other? So on this slide, you can see the process that we're engaged in, and then the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide shows you a kind of frozen static image of the State of the Union speeches over 200 years, pooled. They're frozen into a single mapping. And that mapping consists of conversations about things that we recognize. That is, foreign policy, domestic policy, statecraft, production, the Navy, the frontier, land, and so on. And those things also appear as kind of dominant discursive elements at different moments of time. So you could think of these clusters or conversations as the frogs and witches of fairy tales. That is, they're the things that make up the contents of the speeches on which the morphological structure operates. So I mentioned at the start that in Propp's treatment of fairy tales, the morphological structure is a series of operators. Let's say that those operators are things like forking and splitting and so on. Actually, I skipped this slide. This just shows you kind of the distribution of topics over time. But let's say that these operators are things like forking and splitting over time. And here we can observe an actual tangible process in our data structures as well. For example, the splitting of a single discourse into two although conjoined, slightly disjoint discourses at another time. So we can observe in the nature of a cluster of words and topics over time as they move from one period to another, kind of a splitting structure there. And we can imagine, actually, ideally, all the various ways in which conversations, that is, clusters of words that convey some kind of conjoined meaning, that are tied through such operators. We can imagine all the ways that those conversations are tied at one time to the next time period. And so in the language that I've used so far, we can imagine how clusters of densely tied words flow over time, how they merge with new clusters, how they fork into multiple clusters, how they remain continuous with the prior cluster, and so on, producing something analogous to a river network in which the meanings of words flow over time, that is, over the course of history, which in the end is something we can induce, a river network mapping of the State of the Union addresses that captures the continuities of the form and the discontinuities of political discourse, marking those periods and conceptual realms in which change occurs and those in which continuity is the main story. So this gives you a kind of mapping of the structure of the various conversations in the State of the Union over time. And you could imagine doing this in lots of ways. You could just imagine running a moving window across the speeches and essentially just kind of keep taking snapshots and watching conversations change. Or you could imagine doing it in a slightly more static framework, which is pooling different temporal moments and allowing them to overlap to capture static images. So that's the kind of idea here, is that we can actually uncover the morphological processes and the contents of a large body of text. And then just to show you that we can do something more conventional with data like this, we can also look at people and look at things like heat maps for presidents and see that, yes, presidents do talk about different things if they come from different times. So this graph will just show you the conversation topics on the same static semantic mapping. There's a kind of heat map underlying it where you can see who talks about what. And you can see that Washington, Lincoln, and Reagan actually do talk about different things because they come from different periods. But maybe also something you knew already, presidents like George Bush and Obama actually talk about precisely the same thing in the same way because they arise from the same period, which is, of course, the demand of discourse. So in the end, I'll leave you with what we started with, which is an interesting finding that standing in 2015, we can discover that modernity with respect to political discourse started in 1917. Okay, I'm going to talk for 3 more minutes about another project, which is the Autism Epidemic. And it's a little more traditional, so I can run through it more quickly. Imagine you have some kind of space like that. That happens to be the state of California. And what we did is we captured the births of every child in California off their birth certificates. So this is standard administrative data, and you can see where children are born. And you can see, for example, there's this whole swath of California out there on the right-hand side where no children are born, and that's because there are no adults there. And you get data on those children. And then what we can do is do a large-scale administrative data linkage project and link that to every child ever born in California who's subsequently diagnosed with autism, and that's in the red. And those are children born indexed in red. And you can see also that they're not born where no adults are. In fact, they're born where people are born, which is logical. And we can then populate using a whole bunch of other different kinds of data structures. So this is very standard data science, I think. We can populate those spatial regions with anything we want. Here we're going to populate it, or at least sign it with property values, but we can add to that pretty much any kind of variable we're interested in, including all of the various things that are surrounding people in those areas, like malls, parks, pediatricians, roads, elementary schools, advocacy organizations, smog, et cetera, et cetera. And when we have something like that, we then have a data structure that looks like a full data structure in which we've located every child in a physical space, and we've located every child with autism in the same physical space. And we can discover this really fascinating fact, which is that if a child is born and happens to live within 250 meters of a child who's been previously diagnosed with autism, the probability that they'll be diagnosed with autism in the next year is much, much higher than if they're born in an area where there is nobody with a diagnosis of autism near them. And you get the same effect. You get an opposite effect if they live near a child with mental retardation, so that there's no effect of living near a child with mental retardation. And through a lot of statistical techniques and strategies, which I can't actually take the time to show you, I can tell you that this is not the product of selection. That actually what's really happening, and what we can demonstrate through this work, is that people actually do something quite remarkable with respect to this community, I think, which is that they actually talk about things that are important, like their children's development, to actual real people. They learn from those conversations how to interpret development and how to navigate a complex bureaucracy, and they do that all without using the internet or Google. That is, actual personal conversations influence behavior. And there's a bunch of other slides that support that. I want to leave time for questions, so let me say this work is supported by the NIH, and we're very grateful for that. And I'm super grateful that you've been such a kind audience, so thanks. Anything. So if there's any questions. Yeah, I see a hand over there. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it that people who live close to autistic children know more about autism, or you think there is an underlying some pollution which causes the autism?
I'm absolutely certain that there's no characteristic of the immediate environment in which they live in that's causing autism, other than the twin process of learning how to understand the developmental dynamics in the language of autism, which is something that's exchanged interpersonally, and then even equally critically, learning how to navigate a complex bureaucratic machinery that provides autism services, which is also something that's communicated. If there's an environmental driver of autism, it's in the previous generation, and you can't find it in the local space where children live now or are born. Okay.
My question's pretty simple. Is the diagnosis of autism constant over time?
No. The question was, I don't need to repeat the question. No. No. Conveniently, in California, they don't provide services to children who are diagnosed with now what would be autism spectrum disorders, so Asperger's. So over this period in time from 1986 to 2011, it is fixed there. And so that gives us a baseline from which to work. But but of course, what's really happening is that there's a different slotting mechanism, so that the children who wouldn't have been diagnosed with autism in a previous generation are now diagnosed with autism, because there's a shifting stigma associated with the relationship between autism and mental retardation.
What typifies the pre-modern and modern political discourse?
Yeah, I was afraid someone was going to ask the content question. So there's some morphological, there's some interesting things about the, so very briefly, this is a PNAS paper, which you can look at and actually kind of see the specific linguistic components of what would be characteristic of modern versus pre-modern discourse. But it's really about a different attitude towards governance, and then there's a different attitude towards what we regard as foreign policy. So these two things stand hand in hand. And then there's a structural feature which is really interesting about modern discourse, which is that its rate of change is much more rapid. And so you can actually kind of recover the rapidity of the rate of change, and that's one of the signals of modern discourse in the 11 seconds I had to answer that question.
I'll just ask the question. How stable you think is your result in the political discourse respect to the metric you chose
Yeah.
for computing those graphs?
Yeah, so the underlying structure is because there was a question about sentences and paragraphs. The underlying structure arises from co-occurrence in paragraphs, and so you have to ask yourself, is that the relevant unit for something like the State of the Union? And Slav had mentioned, like we do Shakespeare, obviously the relevant unit has to be sonnets, and if we use the Bible, we might, if we're trying to uncover the morphology of the Bible, we would have a different structure. So with respect to paragraphs, I think this is completely robust. That is, it's robust across the set of different noun phrases that we put in. Whether that's actually the substantive organization is hard to tell, and it's complicated because although there's no signal of the changing. I'd asserted the provenance is the same. The provenance is the same, but the modality of deliverance changes. It changes from written form to, it's initially oral. Jefferson thinks it's an imperial gesture, so he stops presenting it orally. And then it's in written form, then it's on TV. There's no signal of the change in terms of delivery that we can pick up with respect to the timing of these major partitions, but that change of delivery might actually have an effect on what the underlying structure really should be. Was that a fair answer? According to that, we're out of time.
Right. So perfect.
Thanks a lot.
So much for the
Yeah.
wonderful talk, Peter.